All right, welcome to our lecture, the last lecture in our series on identity, and we're talking about how does geography reflect and shape power relationships amongst groups of people. The slides are designed to accompany the book People, Places, and Culture. I'm, of course, Ms. Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture. So we've got a lot of territory to cover, so if I seem like I'm talking fast, it's because I've got a lot of territory and not a lot of time. Fair warning. So, first thing we're going to talk about a little bit is what power relationships mean. And the important thing you got to know with power relationships is it means one person's got the ability essentially to force somebody else to do something or to behave in a certain way. Okay, so when we talk about power relationships between groups, what we've got is one group of people shape the way society forces other groups of people to act, or where they can be welcomed or turned away. And we talked a little bit about this. We talked about, for instance, ethnic neighborhoods. We talked about it a little bit with the last lecture when we talked about bathrooms and things like that. Okay, great examples from U.S. history, any of the Jim Crow laws, right? And Jim Crow, if you're not familiar, those are the laws that say, for example, whites use certain water fountains, blacks use other water fountains, whites live in these neighborhoods, blacks live in those neighborhoods, those kind of formal actual laws. So this is not just people grouping themselves because they like the way, or they like their neighbors. This is like, you cannot do that. Okay. We also see similar kinds of things going on, for example, in Belfast in Northern Ireland, where there's very specific neighborhoods that are Catholic and very specific neighborhoods that are Protestant. And for a Catholic person to go to a Protestant neighborhood or a Protestant to go to a Catholic neighborhood and proclaim who they are really could cause them some pretty significant trouble. Okay, so people just, they don't go into neighborhoods of the other religion, largely because they don't feel comfortable, but also because they just worry about their general health and safety. So, one of the ways that geographers use this kind of information is to use, say, mapping and spatial analysis to predict and explain what populations of people might be affected by natural hazards like earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, hurricanes, or by environmental policies, right? And people with less power tend to get placed in places that are most vulnerable. Okay, so for example, if we're looking at the U.S., it's much more likely to find, say, a garbage dump near a neighborhood that is predominantly people of color than it is a white middle-class neighborhood. Okay, just because the white middle-class neighborhoods, if they tried to build a dump, would very quickly get together and start rallying around not having that near them. And because they've got the time, they've got the money, they've got the influence that those neighborhoods for people of color, for example, often don't have. And that vulnerability that we're talking about really, again, it's fundamentally influenced by specific social or environmental circumstances. And those are unique to place and time. Okay. By using fieldwork, by using interviews, geographers can really see the differences in vulnerability within different groups of people or within populations. So, for example, if we're talking about Sub-Saharan Africa, say, a lot of Sub-Saharan Africa, especially when we're talking about the rural areas, numerically there are significantly more women than there are men. Okay? And because of this, women produce about 70% of the region's food, right? And again, numbers are probably as of about 2010. And almost all of that production occurs without the aid of modern technology. Okay. In the eastern part of Africa, cash crops like tea are sometimes called men's crops because the men trade in what the women produce. And if you think back and you remember to earlier in the year when you were reading, there was a field note where it was talking about how one of the governments, and I'm drawing a total blank on which African country it was, wanted to help encourage tea production, and they paid money to the owners of the land, which was the men, not to the women who were actually doing the producing, right? And it's that same kind of idea. But it's worth noting as well, when we talk about women in sub-Saharan Africa, there are some important exceptions. For example, the country of Uganda is a leader in affirmative action for women, and affirmative action just means that it's essentially kind of like a series of preferences to encourage women, in this case women, to go into fields or to engage in activities that might traditionally have been closed off to them, as a way of encouraging the spread of women and women's power. The country of Rwanda, which about 20, not even 20 years ago, was rocked by civil war. And I mean, just literally rocked by, there was genocide going on, kind of rocked by civil war, is now the first country in the world where women hold more than 50% of legislative seats. Okay, so there's some important, really good things going on in sub-Saharan Africa as well. I don't want to make it sound like it's all just bad. If we want to look at, say, the gender empowerment measure, which is a 0 to 1 scale, okay, what we can do is look at what are some of our trends across space. And here, right, we can look, for example, we notice, unsurprisingly, much of North America, much of Europe is at 0.76 or higher, meaning that women are basically equal with men in terms of access to resources, in terms of pay and things like that. If, areas like China, Argentina, Chile, areas like that, it's not great, not bad, it's pretty high. And then on down the scale, right, until we get to, say, Saudi Arabia or Yemen, where women really are not equal to men in any sense of the word, right? For instance, if we're talking about Saudi Arabia, we talk about how women aren't even allowed to drive cars there. Women have to get permission from their spouses or their male guardian to leave the country. That kind of thing is what we're talking about when we say not at all equal, not at all empowered. Okay. Another example of where we can see some of the ways geography reflects and shapes power relationships is the example of dowry deaths. And we see this a lot of times associated with India. It's not the only place you see it, okay, but it is one of the places where it occurs more often. And oftentimes in an arranged marriage, what you see is the dowry is the price paid to the bride's family, paid by the bride's family to the groom's father. And this is a historical thing. Essentially what it has to do with is the fact that the groom's family is taking on an extra knock with you. Okay? So what it is it's theoretically, at least, it's money to help support the extra person. But in extreme cases, disputes over the dowry can and have led to the death or serious injury to the bride. Right? So if there's a change, for example, at the last minute over what the dowry is going to be, or if the bride's father or bride's family isn't able to come up with the dowry that they promised, right? That's a huge problem. And that's the type of thing that can lead to that death or that serious injury. Right? Because of things like this, we've got power relationships that place women below men in India. Okay, and we can even see these power relationships when we look at issues, for example, not too long ago, 6 months, maybe a year ago, there was an incident where a young lady was gang raped on a bus in India, right? And it was this huge, big thing and ultimately led to a bunch of protests and some new training and laws in place to help level out a little bit those power relationships between men and women. The family courts in India actually passed an act in 1984 to provide some support for women who feared being killed over disputes about their dowry. So it's not that India is not doing anything about it. It's just that it's still pretty bad. Right? This practice is not declining in India in terms of dowry deaths, but what is happening instead is you see the number of marriages that are not arranged is on the rise. Okay, so people are arranging their own mates or their own marriages, and then their parents are just kind of having the final say. So many of these what we'd call love marriages, right, which is pretty common here in the U.S., a lot of these couples are starting to meet online and things like that. And the number of divorces is also on the rise, which is incidentally a sign that the power relationships are becoming a little more equal because women are not worried about being able to support themselves or children or things like that. Look, about 1 in 1,000 marriages ending in divorce in India. So that's about 1/100 of 1%. Okay. Way, way lower than what we see here in the U.S., right? So just as some of the statistics point to that in an improving place, for example, the number of love marriages, the fact that divorce is also on the rise, other statistics still confirm that India has a preference for males overall. And, for example, like I said, that incident that occurred where the men gang raped the young lady on the bus, that practice of dowry deaths and things like that. We look at ethnic groups, we can talk about urban areas, right, which is a great place to see the shifting power relations and dynamics amongst ethnic groups. What we can see is that there's an ebb and a flow of acceptance across time in areas that have multiple ethnicities. So what that means is that sometimes people are okay with people of other ethnicities, sometimes they're not so much, and a lot of times, interestingly enough, we can correlate that with what's going on economically. Okay? So, in California, for example, and in much of the rest of the United States, what we can see is folks who were classified as Asian, which is a nice, huge, broad category that includes people from China and India and Bangladesh and oftentimes Pakistan, right? Is kind of drawn around stereotype of what some call a model minority. And the myth of the model minority really paints Asians as good, hardworking people who, despite suffering through discrimination, harassment, and exclusion, have found ways to prosper through peaceful means. But what's really interesting about this is this idea of the model minority only fits for certain groups, only fits well for certain groups, and not only that, but it really masks a lot of disparities and differences amongst groups of Asians, and Asian Americans, even when we're talking about just, like, say, Pakistanis versus Indians versus Chinese or Japanese. Okay, so this doesn't even look at an individual level, just between groups. It really masks a lot of those differences. So, for example, if we wanted to talk about LA, right? According to geographer James Curtis, Southeast LA County is today home to one of the largest and highest concentrations of Latinos in Southern California, which kind of makes sense, right? It's nice and near Mexico, which is where a lot of Latinos cross over the border. Not to mention the fact that it's in that territory that historically was part of Mexico, and that the really only became part of the United States in the mid 1800s. Okay. What we see happening is what's called barrioization, okay, and barrio is just a Spanish word that means neighborhood, but what that process is it kind of describes a change that's seen in Hispanic populations of neighborhoods, jumping, say, from over 4% in 1960 to 90% in 2000. Now we're still talking about Southeast LA County, right? And so this can lead to some really interesting dynamics and can lead to a lot of tensions. For example, in the early 1990s, right, what we see is there's some riots in LA after the verdict in the Rodney King case that lead to death, injuries, and about $1 billion in property loss that occurs in a lot of those areas because people are fed up. They feel like the authorities aren't representing them, and if you're not familiar with the Rodney King case, essentially what happened is you have an African American male who's driving a car, he's high, he's drunk, he's driving erratically, he gets pulled over by cops, he gets the crap kicked out of him. There's some debate about whether or not he was fighting back. There was video footage involved that apparently didn't show the whole thing. But at any rate, what ends up happening is Rodney King is severely beaten. The LA DA presses they end up pressing federal civil rights charges actually against the cops who were then subsequently acquitted. And there's several days of riots that occur resulting in large-scale property loss. So if you want to look, for example, at the changing ethnic composition of South Central LA from 1960 to 1980, you can see that change across time as white folks are moving out, black folks are spreading across. You see also the Asian folks move in a little bit, and then they start to move out. We've got some mixed areas, and what you see is that Hispanic folks are kind of going in along some of the edges there. Right, and those, by the way, a lot of those businesses that were harmed were Korean businesses that were in black neighborhoods. So I'm about out of time, so I'm just going to go ahead and wrap it up and just say we've talked a lot about how place can influence and can show power dynamics between groups of people. If you have any questions, go ahead, please feel free to bring them into class, and I'd be delighted to answer them. See you next time we meet.